Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 140. I am your host, as usual, Pannobhasa. This is my beverage, which, I've been kind of phony just now because I've had to restart this video like the third time. In fact, at one point, I had to delete and trash my OSB studio and re-download it just to get it to work. Restarted the computer, everything. It's just, for some reason, some higher being or lower being or some entity is trying to prevent me from doing this Q&A. And so I've already started on the beverage. I put the umbrella back in just for appearance's sake. And I'm starting late. It's going to be after midnight by the time I'm done with this, especially if I have to keep starting the video over and over again. But I had to go out and buy dirt today, and because I'm going to plant a peach tree probably tomorrow, the gods willing. And then I had to come home, and my woman groomed me. She used to be a professional dog groomer, and she's going for the schnauzer look. She says I have hair like a schnauzer. And for those of you who don't like the long beard, it's going to get longer. It's getting longer. It's almost long enough to start with a tiny braid. And sooner or later, there's a good chance that a Mjolnir bead is going to appear at the bottom of this. It's only an experiment. All things are impermanent. But brace yourselves. And we got approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 questions, spanning from the ridiculous to the sublime. And so I guess we should just wade right into this. And the first question is from La Infamia, who has kind of a female name in the YouTube comments, but recently joined the Discord server and has a male name in the Discord server. So it could be that we're just inclusive in our Discord or some such. But anyways, La Infamia says, and I have to admit, La Infamia, being a newcomer, does not fully appreciate the limitation to 3 questions per episode. So we're just going to be a little bit indulgent here and just lump La Infamia's first 3 questions into one question. So La Infamia's first 3 questions that are being lumped into one question are: do monks can train or fight in Letway? And Letway is like Burmese kickboxing, I'm pretty sure. And then La Infamia says, it's like a religion in Myanmar, the Letway matches? ? And then also La Infamia says, did you watch one? ? So I'm just going to lump all those into the one question of, what about Burmese Letway kickboxing? And with regard to, can monks train or fight in Letway? They're not supposed to. It's just like the sloppiest, laxest, least conscientious monks that would do that sort of thing. So I'm sure that there are monks who do kickboxing. For example, monks who were into kickboxing before they became monks, they might still do some kickboxing stuff after they're monks, but the lay people tend to frown upon this sort of thing. In Thailand, it's even worse. Like monks who even walk around in the afternoon in public can get scowls and grumbles from the lay people because they're held to a higher standard. They've got rules of discipline to follow. And so really it is just it's the least conscientious, most shameless monks, especially in the big cities like Mandalay, which still exists in smoking ruins after the big earthquake, I assume, that they're the ones who are into this. In fact, I read a long time ago that around 1988, there was a riot in Mandalay started by Buddhist monks who were refused boxing tickets. You know, they wanted to go to a boxing match, possibly kickboxing, because that's the big thing in Burma. And so they tried to get into a kickboxing match the ticket vendor would not sell them tickets because they're monks and this is inappropriate for monks. And so they just ran amok. Or so I read. And it wouldn't surprise me because Mandalay monks are notorious for being some of the worst monks in Burma. In general. So monks, yeah, if they train or fight in Let's Way, I'm sure that some of them do, but it's not the best sort of monks. There are certain like monasteries in the Mandalay area that have soccer teams too. So sometimes you'll see out in the field like monks, their loins girded out there kicking a soccer ball around, like playing soccer. And that also is something that serious monks would not seriously consider, but Mandalay monks, pretty much anything goes. They're kind of like medieval Catholic monks. There's a few saintly ones, but the overwhelming majority are kind of the other end of the spectrum, or a lot of them are. So, let's see, Lamphemia says, it's like a religion in Myanmar, the Letway matches, ? I really wasn't exposed to it. I didn't hear about it very much. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of, it's called cane ball, I think. I can't remember the Burmese name for it, but it's a ball about this big made out of wicker. And it's just sort of a hollow, I mean, you can see the spaces through it. It's just a wicker ball, not really solid. And it's sort of like a hacky sack used to be in America where, Burmese guys will sit around kicking this cane ball around. And sometimes they'll even play a kind of volleyball where you're only allowed to use your feet to kick this thing back and forth. It usually doesn't go back and forth across the net very many times, at least not with the rank amateurs that I observed. So, I wouldn't say that it's like a religion in Myanmar. I mean, the main religion in Myanmar, of course, is Buddhism, which is taken far more seriously than kickboxing. But, I mean, it might be that kickboxing is taken more seriously in general in Thailand than in Burma. But, I mean, I'm sure that for some people, it's like a religion. There's all these different groups of people, different interests and so forth. I just really did not associate with those people because I was pretty much living in caves and like remote forest huts when I was living in Burma. So the last part of this question is, did I watch one? And no, I have never seen a kickboxing match except for like brief bits on television. For example, there was a Southeast Asian Games several years ago where a Burmese man won in kickboxing against a relatively large Australian kickboxer. And the Burmese were just beaming with national pride over that this little Burmese kickboxer beat up the big Australian kickboxer. But aside from that, it's my experience is that it really is not that big of a deal in Burma. So I'm just going to move on to Lamphemia's second question, considering all the kickboxing questions just to be one kind of group compound question. Lamphemia says, did you get any tropical disease while your time in Burma? If yes, how you dealt with it living in caves or rural villages with no Western medicine, just waiting until the disease is gone? Well, I had falciparum malaria like 7 or 8 times when I was in Burma. And I mean, everyone, like Westerners, know that you're going to live in some place like Burma. You got to have the pills that will cure you of malaria wherever you go. You always you've got a first aid kit. It's got like antibiotics and first aid cream and that kind of stuff, dewormer, that kind of stuff. And you got to have malaria pills. That's one of the most important things. So the first 2 times I had it, I was hospitalized. The first time, I hadn't had malaria before. Fortunately, I knew enough about malaria that I knew that I had like this killer headache all the time. and nothing would, like aspirin, nothing would make it go away. And then I'd have like chills and fevers on alternate days. So like the third day, or the third time I had the chills and fevers, like one day chills and fevers, second day I feel better, but I still have the killer headache. Third day chills and fevers, which are worse. Next day after that, I feel a little better, but have the killer headache. Next day after that, chills and fever again. Then finally I realized I gotta have malaria. And I hadn't been in an area that was endemic with malaria for several months at this time. Still, it was just latent in the system until it found its opportunity to burst forth, and chills and fever and killer headaches and so forth. So I wound up in the hospital with that one. Christmas Day, somebody came visit me, and I just come out of my cave, say, "Merry Christmas, I have malaria." And they just kind of loaded me into the Jeep and took me into town and took me to a hospital. And then I got malaria again about a year later. It was always when I was visiting Olondo Kathapa National Park. When I'd go to Olondo Kathapa National Park, every time I went there, I'd wind up coming down with malaria at least once. So I went to the hospital for that too. But then, and then when I had the second time I had malaria, I wasn't nearly as sick as the first time because I took the medicine quicker that time. But still, I had a fever of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which was not particularly good. I mean, I probably cooked my brain a little bit. There are people in Burma who have had severe malaria, who they're just nutty. It's like their brain cooked because their fever got so high. But after the second time, it's like one day chills and fever, next day no chills and fever, day after that chills and fever again. It's falciparum malaria. You take the pills. And the pills, which are based on quinine, are almost as bad. Like the side effects of the medicine, of the cure, is almost as bad as the malaria itself. It's just lots of like vertigo, and you don't feel really good when you take the pills either. And aside from malaria, the only tropical disease that I had of note would be I had got some kind of hepatitis. And 3 different doctors gave me 3 different diagnoses. I mean, fortunately, it wasn't B or C. It wasn't one of the bad hepatitis that you don't cure. It was just some kind of A. But one doctor, the first one, said that it was like some kind of side effect of malaria, malaria, which I hadn't had malaria in a while. So I was kind of skeptical of that. Another doctor, one in Rangoon, told me that dysentery amoebas had invaded my liver. He called it amoebic hepatitis, which is interesting. It's kind of the most interesting sounding disease. Like, I was like attacked by amoebas, but I think probably the third doctor just said it's probably just something that you ate or drank. And I would guess that's probably what happened. A monk who goes for alms round, it's like among villagers that have not much concept of hygiene, or especially of like germ theory. That, I mean, I've talked about this sort of thing before. People like just sneezing directly into the food before offering it, that kind of thing. So yeah, I had malaria like 7 or 8 times, and you just have to have the pills, otherwise you die. The Burmese have like a certain natural resistance, and gradually, even someone like me built up a gradual resistance, but still I'd be dead several times over if I didn't have mefloquine tablets. And the hepatitis, I might have survived, but I was very sick. That was a weird time. It was a very different kind of sickness than malaria, just because it just felt like my life force was running low, like my battery was in the red, kind of a feeling. It was just my vitality was just at low ebb. I was starting to think maybe I was going to die that time. But I didn't. I got better. And I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thought Fog. And this is not particularly Dhamma oriented. But what is your favorite pizza? And I guess my favorite pizza would be black olive and onion, thick crust, preferably Sicilian style. Although I do like pizza margherita with pesto on it. That's good too. But yeah, just black olive and onion, thick crust with extra cheese. So I'm just going to move on to Thought Fog's next question. What are good questions to ask meditation masters? Well, I mean, you could ask them how they became a meditation master. You know, what kind of meditation technique did they start with? And, you know, how did they develop it over time until they reached mastery? I mean, that would probably be a good kind of question to ask a meditation master is, you know, what kind of meditation did you do as a beginner that helped you to progress to becoming a meditation master? And even if they explain it to you, it won't necessarily work with you because one size does not fit all with regard to meditation. What works, some people, they'll take to a certain kind of meditation like a duck takes to water, and other people, they'll just never make any progress with it. You know, there's just their mind is working in a different way that responds better to a different kind of meditation. But if they're a true meditation master, like with regard to teaching it, they might know several different meditation techniques that you could try, that sort of thing. But of course, good question to ask a meditation master would be questions about meditation and how to become a good meditator. You know, how to get make progress in meditation. Questions like that, rather than just asking them, you know, what's their favorite pizza and so forth. So, next question from Thought Fog is, do you still meditate? And I no longer sit in formal meditation. I no longer sit cross-legged on the floor doing formal meditation. I just assume that, I mean, I'm not going to be able to do any justice to the kind of meditation I was doing when I was living alone in a cave. So I don't want to just keep wallowing with elementary level meditation techniques. And so if it spontaneously arises like Om or just spontaneous mindfulness of whatever I'm doing, that's fine. But no, I do not sit cross-legged in meditation anymore. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, in this video, he's talking about the previous video where I was wearing a baseball cap. He says, in this video, you look like a Canadian trucker with that hat and beard. It looks like you just can't escape your good looks. On that note, what is your opinion of the Canadian truckers getting their bank accounts frozen by Justin Castro a few years ago? Well, I mean, I do not approve of protesters getting their own money deprived of them. It's like, I mean, that's just authoritarianism, just the standard kind of castrated social Marxism that the left favors nowadays. So, I mean, the worst they were doing was just like blowing their horns in protest in populated areas. But aside from that, I mean, they had the right to protest. It may be that they were violating some city ordinance by blowing air horns in populated areas or some such, but still that would not justify having their bank accounts frozen by Fidel, Justin Castro. So let's just move on to PSA's next question. Are you a Clemson Tiger or a Gamecock fan? And the answer is no. I've never been into college sports. Never. Not even for 5 seconds. I just never had any interest in college sports, college athletics. You know, I might watch like a track meet or something in which I know nothing about any of the competitors just to watch them compete, that sort of thing. But Clemson, I mean, Clemson is the big thing. There's a lot of people with Clemson bumper stickers, and there's one guy at work named Lee who's just totally into Clemson. He wears like a Clemson not a baseball cap, but just like a beanie. It says Clemson, you know, orange, a lot of orange, like the Tiger track. And one time he told me that at night he relaxes by watching reruns of old Clemson games, like from the 1990s. And I just don't get it. pretty much lost interest in professional sports also. So yeah, I'm Bob Jones. Bob Jones all the way. Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, if they got an athletics department. If they don't, then I'd have to go with, what's the other one? Furman University. I think their team is called the Paladins or something like that. So, yeah, let's just move on to PSA's third question. And by golly, it is a Buddhism question. And so PSA says, is there any part of the Abhidhamma that you particularly like or would highly recommend others to read and study? I don't particularly like any of it really, and I wouldn't highly recommend others to study it unless you just want to be literate in Theravada Buddhist orthodoxy, just so that you'll know what Theravada Buddhism officially teaches. In which case, I would stay away from the Abhidhamma texts themselves and read something like the Abhidhammata Sangaha, which is what most Abhidhamma students in Burma study. You don't go straight to the Pali texts, which are practically unreadable. They're so hyper technical and intellectual that some Abhidhamma texts, I mean, it's like trying to study a calculus text. But the Abhidhammata Sangaha, which in Burmese is called Dinju, it's sort of a compendium and synopsis, summary of the basic teachings of Abhidhamma. And there are books in English that are modeled on the Abhidhammata Sangaha. Like I think Sayadaw Usilananda wrote a kind of synopsis or summary of Abhidhamma. Also, there's Dr. Min Tin Mon in Burma wrote The Essence of Buddha Abhidhamma. If you live in Burma, it's almost impossible not to have a copy of it because people will keep offering you copies, and no matter how many of them you give away, you just keep getting more. I met Dr. Min Tin Mon. He was a very nice guy up until he realized that I did not take Abhidhamma seriously, did not think that the Buddha really taught it, and then he wouldn't look at me anymore. But the one book of Abhidhamma that I did read with some interest is the Petavatthu, which I think is like the third or fourth book of Abhidhamma. And it's unlike all the other books. It's really, it shouldn't really be an Abhidhamma book. The Petavatthu. It's not dealing with, how mind works and this sort of thing, like causal relations, like Patana teaches, this sort of thing. The Petavatthu is mainly kind of a guide to Theravada Buddhists in debating the monks from other schools of Buddhism. And that's a pretty good indication the Buddha didn't really teach it, because it arose around the time of the Emperor Ashoka, and it's regarding like disputes or controversies with other philosophical schools in Buddhism that didn't exist in the Buddhist time, but did exist in Ashoka's time. So, that's kind of interesting. In a way, it's kind of sad when your side, Theravada, they use really lame arguments like bad logical reasoning and so forth to win their points. But it does give you a good idea of the philosophical landscape of Burma in ancient India around the time of Ashoka, like 3rd century BCE. So that's kind of interesting. And in the Polytext Society translation, it's got a long introduction, a scholarly introduction by the translator discussing the evolution of Buddhist philosophy and the branches of the Buddhist family tree, sort of. First you had the first great schism between the Mahasangika and the Staviras, and then the different branches, the different schools that arose from each side. It's interesting. It was interesting to me. But, it's not really necessary. Like the English monk Jnanavira used to say that the less Abhidhamma you know, the better, because It's the less you have to unlearn in order to really know Dhamma correctly. So, I mean, for me, it would just be like an academic thing. If you just want to be literate in what Theravada Buddhist orthodoxy teaches, then it may be to your advantage to be familiar with Abhidhamma, like just studying the Abhidhammata Sangaha or some book based on the Abhidhammata Sangaha would probably get you farther than tackling the Abhidhamma texts themselves. And the Petavatthu is kind of like an anthropological study on early-ish Buddhism in India, like around 100 years or 150 years after the time of the Buddha. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, what is going on karmically when a chicken's head is cut off and the body is still running around? If there's no consciousness left in the chicken's body, then I guess you could say that it's just the karma of the observers of the still moving headless body to see something weird, and it has nothing to do with the chicken's karma, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't think it would have much to do with the chicken's karma. I mean, technically, when somebody cuts the head off of a chicken, I experienced this when I was a kid. We lived on a small farm. We butchered chickens sometimes. The chicken is just like flopping all over the place after its head gets cut off, which is just like the firing of nerve impulses. And this is kind of a macabre kind of a story, but I was told that during the Napoleonic Wars that the French soldiers would do the same sort of thing to humans, where they would cut off a human, like an enemy soldier's head, and then they'd have like an iron plate that they had been heating in the fire. They'd stick that onto the neck, the stump, and then the body would actually get up and run around. And that was how these French soldiers amused themselves back when French soldiers were still badasses. So it's really not the karma of the soldier who is deceased, because his spirit has already moved on. The chicken spirit, such as it was, has already moved on. It's from the biological point of view, it's just like random firing of nerve impulses. Although you could say that from a karmic point of view, it's more the karma of the observer than the karma of the deceased individual whose spirit is no longer there. Their karma has already, the momentum of their karma has already moved elsewhere. So from a purely like from the point of view of subjective idealism, then certainly that their behavior would be your own karma, the karma of the observer. But that would apply even when the person's still alive. Whatever a living person does that you are witnessing, that you are experiencing, that's your karma, not theirs. I mean, they're making their own karma by doing this stuff, but it's the fruition of your own karma that causes you to see it and experience it. So from that point of view, it doesn't really matter whether the chicken or the enemy soldier is alive or dead, that whatever that they're doing, that's your own karma when you are witnessing it. Even though they're making their own karma, but that's on them. If it wasn't your karma to experience it, you wouldn't experience it. So I think I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second question, which is still discussing a chicken with its head cut off. Do you believe the body of the chicken is still sentient after it has lost its head? Well, the human body, like in a coma, would be similar. It's like the enemy soldier with his head cut off and the chicken with its head cut off. I mean, they'd be dead. I mean, there wouldn't be like the brain consciousness anymore, but still there would be a kind of like a basic body consciousness, sort of like a colony of protozoans that are still alive. It'd probably be a little more advanced than a colony of protozoans, because there would still be somewhat of a nervous system that to some extent would still be connecting parts of the body. There'd still be the spinal cord, which does perform certain stereotypical brain functions. So there could be a kind of, subconscious sort of quasi-sentience. I mean, I don't know if you'd call it sentience. There's a certain level of consciousness still there. But it wouldn't be like the main being that has the karmic stream that has already moved on to another existence by the time this sort of thing happens. But you just have like this lower level of, I don't even know what you'd call it. Some sort of animal like a jellyfish that doesn't really have a brain, that sort of thing. It'd be sort of that level of consciousness, maybe. So I think I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, do you believe in the Bardo realm? And are we recording? Yeah, it says we are. Although I'm a little more insecure this time because I had so many problems trying to get OBS to start up. It kept crashing over and over again until finally I had to just delete the app and re-download it. But let's just get back to this question here. So Xenothoid says, do you believe in the Bardo realm, or is it just an instant click from one body to the next? Perhaps some Bardo realm shenanigans could explain what's going on with the chicken. Yeah, I don't think it's Bardo realm shenanigans that are causing a decapitated chicken to flop around like the chicken yard. Again, it's probably from the scientific point of view, it would just be like random nerve firing, that kind of thing. But with regard to the Bardo realm, the Theravadan idea that there is no intermediate state, that just one moment you die, the very next moment you take a rebirth as some other being, I don't think that's necessarily in conflict with the more Tibetan idea of this intermediate state called the Bardo realm. It just would be that the Bardo realm would be a kind of spirit existence. So you would cease existing as a human and then immediately take up this kind of spirit existence that would correspond to a Bardo realm until the time is ripe for you to take on like another human existence or whatever other kind of existence you're going to take. So yeah, it supposedly, from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, it's the instant click from just the very next moment that you have to take. There has to be like an unbroken continuum of consciousness. So as soon as you cease being conscious and alive in this life, it's just boom, you have to like take rebirth linking consciousness, and it just continues like more or less of an unbroken stream of consciousness, so to speak. But again, you could like have a 40-day long spirit existence, some sort of lower Deva realm, higher Peta realm kind of existence that is sort of a filler until you're ready to take the next human existence or whatever the existence is going to be. Maybe it's like you got to wait until the conditions are just right because you're supposed to be born in a certain way to a certain kind of person. And, she's only 8 months pregnant or whatever. And so there might be kind of a wait where you would take a different kind of existence as, like I said, low level Deva realm, high level Peta realm, that kind of thing. Just processing or doing whatever it is that you do, more or less along Tibetan Book of the Dead lines, maybe not. I really can't say. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Psst. And Psst says, are you a chess player? And then there's sort of a subsequent question here of online chess. And I haven't played a game of chess in many years. Before I became a monk, for Christmas one year, I got a computer chess game. This is back before it was all done on a computer screen. It was like an actual board with little pieces that you moved around. And I figured I was a pretty good chess player, sort of. At least I considered myself to be a pretty good chess player. So I thought, well, I'll just start at level 1 and just keep playing until it starts beating me. Just keep going up one level after each victory until I meet my match, so to speak. And to my humiliation, I was beaten at level 1. So I went to a bookstore and bought a book on chess tactics and strategy and read about half of it. Books on chess strategy are pretty dry reading, but I learned enough from the first half of this book on chess strategy that before I became a monk, I played that same computer chess game at the highest level and won. It might take 45 minutes for this little computer chess game to make its next move. It was thinking a long time, but still I was able to beat it. I played one game at the highest level and won. So I pretty much, that was sort of my meteoric career as a chess player. I think all Apple computers, or I'm pretty sure all Apple computers have a chess program on them. I have a fairly good chess game on this computer. I can play against the computer, and I maybe did it a few times as a monk. Like maybe 15 years ago, I was just sort of bored or something and just decided I was gonna play some chess against the computer, and I did fairly well, but yeah, it's not something that I'm really avid about, and I've never played online chess. I've played against another human and I played against the computer, but when I played against another human, it was like on a real chessboard in real life, so to speak. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, astrological significance of beverage, ? And I'm happy to announce that this coffee has no astrological significance whatsoever. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question. What if prime numbers contain the secret of samsara? Well, I kind of doubt it. In fact, I kind of doubt it. I really don't think so. So I think I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' third question, which is as follows. Has anyone really been far even as decided to use even go want to do look more like? And yes. So I think I'm going to move on to the next question here. I don't know what Philalethes was on when he was asking these questions, but I get the feeling that it was a fairly intense experience. So, next question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, in the vein of Master Poe's Fred or Jung question from your last Q&A, Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World. And I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking. It's like, which book did I prefer? Which book do I think more accurately represents like postmodern Western civilization? Which book do I think was more well written or more prescient? I'm not sure what the question is exactly. All he's got is Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World. And of the two, I prefer Huxley's Brave New World. I prefer Aldous Huxley's writing style to Orwell's writing style. He's very depressing. It's like in Orwell's novels, it's like the hero, the most likable person in the story, always gets utterly destroyed by the evilest person in the story. So Huxley was a little more subtle, a little more sophisticated, I think. And I do think that his Brave New World comes closer to the globalist cyberpunk dystopia that we are beginning to observe lately. Like, a lot of people will just say that, what's happening now is like Orwell's 1984. And there are certain parallels, like the Ministry of Truth. it's like the cockroaches have come out in broad daylight. Ever since Trump ran for president the first time, it's now just painfully obvious that the mainstream media are just shameless propagandists. And they just keep doubling down, and their credibility is shot, and their days are numbered. But for the most part, Huxley's Brave New World more accurately describes what the globalists are trying for, and what has already been set up. Like, for example, in Orwell's 1984, it's mainly using terroristic tactics against your own people to keep them in line. Whereas Huxley's Brave New World, you're using more the carrot than the stick. You're just keeping them like in a state of doped up euphoria and just consumeristic dopamine hits, and that's how you keep them under control. And another thing from Huxley's Brave New World that was really one of his main points is that you want to eliminate any strong feelings. So it's like with consumerism, you just condition people. If you have any desire for anything, gratify the desire immediately. Don't let it build up. Don't have strong attachments for another person. Don't have family sentiment. Like in Huxley's Brave New World, one of the deadliest insults that you could ask or you could say to someone is, "Who's your mother?" Because they did away with any kind of nuclear family in the Brave New World. In the Brave New World, they went to the extreme of babies being produced in like bio factories. But still, you weren't supposed to get married. You weren't supposed to be faithful to anyone. You're just supposed to move on from one person to the other. Just be sexually promiscuous. No family responsibilities. No loyalty to family that might replace your loyalty to the government. That sort of thing. And that's pretty much what's happening nowadays. So, yeah, I do think that Huxley's Brave New World comes closer to the current state of affairs than Orwell's 1984, even though there is some Orwellian stuff going on too. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question, which is, do you think these books were works of fiction that just happened to foreshadow the dystopian worlds that began to take shape after they were published? Or are they actual blueprints for elites to set them up? I think they were both cautionary tales. They were both not necessarily prophecies, but warning of the direction that like Western civilization could be headed. It's like Orwell was essentially warning against what would happen if Marxism took over the West. That's what Orwell was warning about at the time. Whereas Huxley, he was observing like American, just Western consumerism from like the 1930s and 40s. I'm not exactly sure. I think it was in the 1930s that Brave New World was published. And so he was observing consumerism then and just sort of extrapolating into the future, what direction it would be going in. And he extrapolated fairly well. He missed a few things, like in the Brave New World, the Brave New World was still predominantly ruled by men. He missed out on the whole DEI stuff, which is maybe one reason why the Brave New World was so efficiently run, is because it didn't have diversity hires fucking shit up. So, let's see. Do I think these books were works of fiction that just happened to foreshadow the dystopian worlds that began to take shape, or are they actual blueprints? I think they were warnings. Both of them were warnings. It's like, this could happen if you don't be careful, if you don't open your eyes. And we pretty much dodged the Orwellian bullet. But the Brave New World, where it's just the government is using dopamine hits to keep everyone docile and just, causing them to, if they feel strongly about anything, they're going to feel strongly about whatever the government wants them to feel strongly about. So, yeah, it was definitely globalist. The Brave New World was a globalist. And it was more humane, I guess, than Orwell's. Like in the Brave New World, they wouldn't take the dissidents, like the people that just don't fit in, the people that are just too conscious, that can't just go along with this mindless conditioning that everyone's following along with. And they wouldn't just like torture them to death like in Orwell's 1984. They just get sent to some island. So that would be preferable, I guess. If I had to live in the Brave New World or in the 1984 Oceania, then I'd have to go with Huxley, and maybe I'd wind up on one of those nice islands. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Kundru. And Kundru says, are there any stories from the Petavatthu that are memorable or stand out to you? And there really is only one. And I've told this story before in my Q&As. There's the story of there's this woman who was a virtuous woman, except on one occasion she was unfaithful to her husband. And worse than that, when he was suspicious and asked her about it, she denied it and even made this oath. It's like there was like this big black dog walking by, and she says, if I'm lying, may that dog just kill me, something like that. And so not just because she was unfaithful to her husband, but also, even more importantly, because of this false oath that she made. She swore to a lie that in her next life, because she was mainly very virtuous, she and her husband were making donations to the monks all the time. So she wound up living like a goddess in the foothills of the Himalaya mountains. She'd be like level of the four great kings, like Deva realm. And, it's like pleasure gardens with these celestial fruit trees, this huge mansion that she lived in. She had this troop of like 500 attendants who were like her 500 friends who vouched for her when she was lying. They like lied for her and said, no, she didn't do anything wrong. So she lived like a goddess, except every night she'd go into like this trance state and come down out of the mansion, and this big black dog would devour her, leaving only the bones. The bones would then fall into this lotus pond, and then in the water, she would grow a new body, climb out of the water, go back up to bed, and then the same thing would repeat every night. And that's the way the Petas in the Petavatthu are. It's kind of strange that in Theravada Buddhism, it's like a spectrum, like ghosts and gods are on a spectrum where the highest ghost is just right up against the lowest god. And sometimes the only difference is they live like gods. They have like the palaces and everything, but they did this one wrong thing, usually something to do with not donating, being stingy towards monks or something. Like in the Petavatthu, there's a lot of that. And so, they might be like naked, or they might smell bad or something. That's like their punishment. They're like a god, except for they got this one defect still. And so eventually there was this heroic king who, it was like some kind of celestial peach or something, some fruit that got washed down into the Ganges River from this palace that had the celestial fruit trees and everything. And if you eat of it, then it may not make you immortal, but it like makes you young again. It prolongs your life. And so this heroic king went off in search and found this goddess. And he was the first man that this woman, this Peta, and her retinue of female Peta servants had seen. And so they're all just, a man. They're just like all excited, all in a tizzy over that. And he wound up, having the romantic affair with her and found out about the dog. And then he kills the dog. And it was mainly her karma had worked itself out. She had paid her dues sufficiently that, it was in accordance with her karma that this heroic king, human male, killed the dog that was eating her every night. But then he had to go back to his kingdom and left her behind. And I don't remember exactly what happened after that. But I do think I even have a blog post where that is translated. I can't remember now. You might go to my blog and just do a search on Petavatthu or something, and there's a good chance it would turn up there. But mainly the Petavatthu, it's one of the latest additions to the Pali Tipitaka, and it's kind of, I mean, if you read it, you see that it was probably written by wise guy monks talking about how by, supporting the Sangha, you're going to have great things happen to you. But if you don't support the Sangha very well, then bad things are going to happen to you. And, it's just, I mean, it still happens to this day in Burma, where some of the Seattles will be giving these sermons on by offering robes to the monks, you're going to be reborn rich and beautiful, this kind of stuff. And that seems to be one of the kind of a predominant theme throughout the Petavatthu. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Kyundru's second question, which is, do you think the average layperson would benefit from reading the Petavatthu? Why or why not? I mean, it's interesting, legendary stories, and it can give you insight. I mean, it's part of the Pali Tipitaka, and so it'll give you insight into the culture and mental states of the formulators of Orthodox Theravada. I don't think it's necessary to read it at all. I think most Theravada Buddhists do not read the Petavatthu. And if you just want to read stories that are entertaining and maybe even uplifting and give you some insight into what society was like in ancient northern India, you'd be much better off reading the Dhammapada commentary. I think the Dhammapada commentary would be much more beneficial to someone wanting to read stories from ancient India than reading the Petavatthu or the Vimanavattu also. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga'u. And Yuga'u says, why do enlightenment people still need to meditate sitting and walking? I don't think they still need to meditate. I think an enlightened person is always going to be in a meditative state no matter what they're doing. Although if they became enlightened through practicing Dhamma, like they're a monk, for example, they're going to continue doing monk stuff because they're still a monk. And, meditating, if you're enlightened, you're getting into really profound meditative states. I mean, you might as well be doing that as doing something else. So I do think that a fully enlightened being really has no need for meditation anymore. It could just be sort of residual habits, or it's just a convenient way to pass the time. It's just the thing that they've been doing. It's the traditional thing or the cultural thing or just the thing that they've been doing personally for years. And so they just continue with that. But really, meditation is part of the raft. Formal meditation, like observing your breaths and that sort of thing, is part of the raft that once you cross over to the other side, you don't need it anymore. You don't just carry it on your shoulders, you just leave it behind. So, but still, I do think that an enlightened being is going to be in a profound meditative state all the time. They don't really need the gimmick of sitting cross-legged anymore, although some of them may still do that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, is there any evidence that the Buddha existed outside of Buddhist scripture? How do we know for sure he existed and that he's not an amalgamation of local folklore of wise men making up stories and parables to express wisdom? Well, one part of this, how do we know for sure that he existed? I mean, you can't know for sure that you exist. You can't know for sure that Abraham Lincoln existed. There's photographs and all that. But, I mean, Bertrand Russell pointed out in one of his books that there's no way you can prove that some God with a strange sense of humor didn't just create this world 5 minutes ago, implanting in us memories of things that never happened. There's no way you can prove that. I mean, skepticism like rules. You just can't. I mean, skepticism can shoot down just about any argument. So we can't know for sure that the Buddha existed. We can't know for sure that India exists even now. Even people living in India can't be 100% sure. And in fact, the philosophical ones would probably doubt it because they would consider it to be Maya or illusion. So there's that. But also, is there any evidence that the Buddha existed outside of Buddhist scripture? I'm not sure if there is any, like the Jain texts are not reliable. I mean, whether they mention the Buddha at all. I mean, the Jain texts were composed considerably after the Buddha's time because the Jains lost their texts twice. And it was all handed down orally for centuries. So, I mean, that's not persuasive evidence, even if there is mention of the Buddha in Jain texts. I don't know of any inscriptions that go back to the time of the Buddha. I mean, the best evidence that the Buddha existed is just the body of text of all the stuff that he supposedly did and said. You know, you've got like his birthplace, his death place, the place of his enlightenment. You've got like the stupas commemorating this that go back to ancient times. And also you've got relics. So relics are part of Maitreya Buddha's second question. So I guess I'll address that when I get to that. Let's see, how do we know for sure he existed? We don't. We can't. Nobody can know. And that he's not an amalgamation of local folklore or wise men making up stories and parables to express wisdom. I don't think that that's the case, though. I think it is more likely, more probable, just going with the whole conventional truth approach to reality, just empirical worldly reality, that it is more likely that Gautama Buddha existed, even if most of the stories attributed to him are not true. Similarly, I feel the same way about Jesus. There's been a lot of people, including some people that I know, who think Jesus never existed. But I do think it's more likely that he did. You can't prove it that he did. You can't prove that he didn't. But it does seem more likely. You know, I accept it as a working hypothesis that Gautama Buddha existed and a working hypothesis that Jesus of Nazareth existed. In fact, hell, I still think that there's a good chance that William Shakespeare really did write his own plays. Although I have a good friend who's really on the Francis Bacon bandwagon. Or there's also, the weird thing is that there's like persuasive cases for like 2 or 3 other people that wrote Shakespeare's plays. And I mean, it really doesn't matter. I mean, what really matters is, does Dhamma help you to cultivate wisdom and purity and so forth? That's really the important thing. So even if the Buddha never really existed, Dhamma is still legitimate. Whereas Christianity, if Jesus never existed, then Christianity pretty much collapses, because how can you accept someone as your savior if they don't exist? But with Buddha, I mean, it wasn't really based on a personality cult, or it shouldn't have been anyway. It's like, you know, after he is gone, the Dhamma is your teacher. And if Dhamma works, you know, if it helps you to get wiser and better, then it's all good. So, yeah, I mean, you can't really be sure about anything that exists outside of your mind. Even some of the stuff that exists inside your mind, you can't be sure of. And I just finished my primary beverage, my designated primary beverage, or DPV. DPB. So I'm breaking into the emergency backup beverage. And I even had this urge earlier that it was just like this little insight that maybe I should have 2 emergency backup beverages, but I just didn't follow through with that. So we're going to see if I live to regret it. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to Maitreya Buddha's second question, which regards relics. As far as his relics, if scientists would carbon date them, will it approximate to someone who existed around 2,500 years ago? I would guess, yeah. I have seen some of the Buddha's relics. At least there's good evidence that they really were the Buddha's relics. That they came from Peshawar. They're the Peshawar relics that are, you can look at them in Burma. They're at the base of Mandalay Hill. I've been to see them twice, at least twice. And I mean, there's some pretty solid evidence, like a chain of custody kind of a thing going all the way back to ancient times. It's like after the Buddha died, his relics were divided up into, I think it was like eight portions, and there were like 8 pagodas or stupas built commemorating these relics. Then during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka, he broke into those and divided them up more and made more stupas around India commemorating the Buddha's relics. And then when the Kushan king Kanishka conquered northwestern India, he did it again. He broke into some of Ashoka's stupas and he enshrined the relics in more stupas. And more importantly, he, at least with regard to the story, his capital city, which was near what is now Peshawar in Pakistan, he built this huge pagoda, which the Muslims destroyed. But it was this huge pagoda in his capital city. And as this emperor, he wanted legitimate relics in his great, huge pagoda. So I'm sure he would have made some effort to get like legit, genuine relics of the Buddha out of some of Ashoka's, or at least out of one of Ashoka's stupas. And then he enshrined them in this huge pagoda at Peshawar. And then the Muslims destroyed the pagoda, wiped out Buddhism in the area. And so it was like in British colonial times, some British archaeologists were thinking, well, I mean, there was this huge pagoda here at one point. Let's just dig down right in the middle of it and see if there's some sort of like a relic chamber. And sure enough, they found this relic chamber that it was like a golden casket. And inside the golden casket was a smaller crystal, like a vial kind of a thing. And it had Kanishka's name inscribed on it. And inside this crystal vial was little pieces of bone. And you can see them to this day at the foot of Mandalay Hill in Burma, if you can get into Burma nowadays. And so I would guess that if someone carbon dated that, one of those little pieces of bone, that it would probably come out, maybe a little after 2,500 years ago. They've sort of, modern Western scholars have been revising the times, the dates of the Buddha, like almost a century or later than tradition has it. But still, it wouldn't surprise me at all if it really was the Buddha's relics. And also there's like the burial stupa of, who was it? I think it was Sariputta. I think traditionally they know where that one is too, so they might be able to find some relics, like biological fragments of bone or something there also that they could test. It's too bad that they were cremated, because then you can't clone them and create like a new Gautama. Although he might not become enlightened this time. I don't know how that would work. If you could somehow clone, like Gautama, Shakyamuni. Of course, he wouldn't be enlightened when he was born. That would be weird. I mean, it might be a whole different karmic stream enters that body, and you might wind up with a very different person. So, yeah, I'm guessing that the Peshawar relics are, I mean, I can't know for sure, but still there is some fairly good evidence that they really are relics of the Buddha. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, are we all stoned? And I think, what, PSA or, no, it wasn't PSA. It was Philalethes. I think Philalethes may have been stoned when he asked his questions. But I think Fred is being more philosophical here. He's not asking if we're all loaded, which we are not. Some of us maybe are. Some of us may have drunk half a bottle of cough syrup right before watching this. Who knows? But, I mean, at a more philosophical point of view, we all have moha, we all have delusion, or what could be called semi-conscious stupidity. Like the word moha, based on my understanding of the term, it does mean something like semi-conscious stupidity. And so pretty much anyone who isn't enlightened could be in that kind of stupor that is similar to being stoned. I mean, in a way, you could say we're kind of intoxicated on the defilements, that kind of thing. You could interpret it philosophically and say, yeah, we're all stoned on defilements or delusion or whatever. But I do appreciate the short question. It's only 4 words. And I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb, sometimes also still known as Libra Lamb, and also, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Man of many names is Stellar Supreme. And he says, can you tell the story of your father being a hobo at one time riding freight trains? And it is true that my father was born in 1921. He was a relatively old man when he had me. And so he was alive during the Great Depression, and he ran away from home as a teenager and became essentially a hobo. I think he was an alcoholic by the time he was 18, and just riding freight trains across the country up until he eventually he joined the CCC for a while, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Like he helped to dig a back door into Oregon Caves at Oregon Caves National Monument, I think it's called. So this is like the Franklin D. Roosevelt's, trying to support the American economy by just having the government paying people to just do public works stuff, that kind of thing. And then eventually he joined the army and fought in World War II. But he did have some stories of just riding freight trains and talking about how there was like a hobo, like a code of honor sort of. And also they had like codes where like if there was like a soft-hearted person that would offer handouts to hobos, and some hobos, they'd leave like this little mark on their fence so that other hobos would know that this person offers food or whatever it is. And I don't know if hobos even still exist. I think nowadays it's more like meth and fentanyl and stuff that the people, you don't see very many just winos or, homeless people that are just drunks. But I think times have changed in that regard. So yeah, he was like a real live hobo who rode freight trains across the country and eventually, he did all sorts of things. I mean, during the Depression. And my father he always, how do I explain this? He was always a nonconformist, was not a follower. He was an explorer of frontiers. My father really loved frontiers. He eventually wound up like big game hunting and gold prospecting in Alaska, which is where I was born. So yeah, he was a hobo. And so I'm just gonna move on to Stellar Supreme, et cetera, et cetera. Second question, which is, what were some of his wild stories of hobo jungles? And one story that he would tell me was just what they would drink, because this was also during the time of Prohibition. So alcohol was illegal, just like marijuana is still illegal in some states of the Union, where one thing that they would drink was shoe polish. that shoe polish had some kind of ethyl alcohol in it, and you'd have to let the black stuff sink to the bottom. So you'd have to set it aside for a while. Like some hobo would steal a case of shoe polish. They'd set it aside, waiting for the big party, and then they'd pass around the bottle of shoe polish. And the last person to take the drink, he'd get the black stuff all over his teeth and his mouth, and he'd get laughed at and ridiculed. Possibly the wildest story, though, my father told of being in a hobo jungle was he was walking along and he saw this hobo cooking chicken legs over a fire. Just like, holding the chicken leg, kind of turn it in his hand over this fire. And my father asked him, where'd you get those drumsticks? And so the hobo leads him around to this freight car of a freight train. And there's crates of live chickens in this freight car. And he couldn't get the whole chicken. It's an awful story, but he couldn't get the whole chicken through the bars of the crate. So, but he could yank legs off these temporarily live chickens, and then he's just going around and just roasting them and burning off the feathers, I guess, just roasting them over the fire. And that kind of shit happens in this world. And there are some people that don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, it's the whole idea of being humane towards animals is a relatively modern idea. I mean, there have always been people who have loved animals and been soft-hearted towards them. The Prophet Muhammad apparently had like consideration towards animals and so forth, even though he did promote, bloody animal sacrifices, like you're supposed to cut the throat of a camel at Mecca, that kind of thing. But it was just like, even in Christianity, killing an animal it's just not on the moral landscape. I mean, it's not part in the equation at all. It's like Jesus helped his disciples catch fish after he died, according to the story. Killing animals, that's what the Old Testament says. It's just, we're here. I mean, humans just have dominion over nature, including animals, and we can do whatever the hell we want to. We can kill animals if we want to. And then we burn them, and it's a pleasing aroma for the Lord. So, yeah, that is kind of strange to me, that just this whole idea of compassion towards animals is relatively rare in the human race. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Norman. And Norman says, if you could redo the path from your early 20s, how would you proceed or do things differently? Well, I mean, that would be assuming that I wouldn't know then what I know now. And so, in all likelihood, I wouldn't change anything. I mean, if I could know then what I know now, I might do things differently, because I wouldn't have to do what I already did. It's like, why go to college again and study the same stuff when you've already learned it? Why study the same things as a monk that I've already learned? I already know that stuff. So from that point of view, I could do something different. But I don't think that's really the implication in Norman's question. In Norman's question, I mean, it's like, if I could redo the path from my early 20s, how would you proceed or do things differently? Yeah, I mean, I really don't think that I don't think I should mess with anything, because things have worked out pretty well. So I shouldn't try to fix anything. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I think I just leave it the way it was. If I had my whole life to live over again, knowing then what I know now already, I might do things very differently. Like, I'd buy Amazon stock when it went on the market in 1997. Probably wouldn't have to be a monk. Look for my sweetie when we're still young, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, if I didn't know then what I know now, I'd just do it the way I did it, because everything happens the way it's supposed to happen, and things seem to have happened fairly well. So I'm just going to move on to Norman's second question, which is, what personality or genetic traits have you noticed in people with high attainments? How can one honestly assess whether enlightenment is within reach in this lifetime? I don't know. I don't think it's possible to assess whether enlightenment is within reach in this lifetime. I mean, with some people, it's maybe fairly obvious that they're just like wallowing in samsara, completely lost in the illusion. They're completely blue-pilled, completely stuck in the matrix. But even somebody like that, they can suddenly have like a near-death experience or some such that just slams them into a different state of consciousness. Whereas there are some people who have high attainments that are just stuck in those high attainments, and they can never really completely transcend this world and become enlightened. Like some Hindu swamis, they just get more and more refined, more and more refined, more and more refined, but it's like they're still stuck. They're stuck in a very refined level of samsara, but they're still stuck in samsara. And that's the way it is with most relatively wise people, most Dhamma teachers, most Dharma teachers, that kind of thing. They're not enlightened yet, and they might have less like realistic chance of becoming enlightened than some other person who just has a near-death experience and gets slammed into a higher mental state. So you can't really tell for sure. Maybe some personality traits, like being more introverted and less extroverted, or even being somewhat homely or having some sort of social handicap that prevents you from really doing well in society and just getting lost in it, where you have some kind of circumstance that keeps you sort of on the fringe as a kind of outsider. Like St. John of the Cross, one of my favorite examples, he was like less than 5 feet tall when he was full grown, just through, they think, through just chronic malnutrition as a child. He had such a rough childhood that just helped to push him in the direction of sainthood. So let's consider this question one more time. What personality or genetic traits have you noticed in people with high attainments? Yeah, they tend to be kind of introverted, quiet, not really effusive, emotional kind of people. Although even effusive, emotional kind of people can still have some kind of experience that just kind of knocks them loose from samsara. So it'd be more of a statistical thing, I guess. And how can one honestly assess whether enlightenment is within reach in this lifetime? I don't think you can. Anything is possible. That's one thing that it's like a great comforting thought from me, even though it can be interpreted positively or negatively, that anything is possible. And that you should never say, well, I can't become enlightened in this life, because you don't know. And if the belief that you can't become enlightened helps you not to become enlightened, you just get locked into it. Sort of like what I was talking about in the previous Q&A with that quote from Albert Camus, where it's like, whatever you consider to be true enslaves you. And a lot of the people that are into all this health, biochemistry stuff on YouTube videos, if they really believe that is true, then it just kind of locks them into that. In a way, it enslaves them. It becomes sort of like a prison. So you're better off not making up your mind with regard to that sort of thing. You shouldn't think that you can't become enlightened, because who knows? Anything is possible. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from the proto-pseudo-monk. And the proto-pseudo-monk, he generally has headings at the beginning of his questions. And the first heading is, on Panyo following Hindu teachings. And then the question is, if the only enlightened beings you believe to exist have been two Hindu saints, why not practice Hinduism or Vedanta instead of Theravada Buddhism? Well, I don't think that they're the only two beings that I believe to exist, although they would be pretty much at the top of the list of people in the past 100 years who may really have been fully enlightened. Would be Ramana Maharshi and Neem Karoli Baba. Both of them Hindus. One of them a Vaishnavite and the other one a Shaivite. They had different approaches to Hinduism. But, like Neem Karoli Baba was a devotee of Hanuman, the monkey god. Whereas Ramana Maharshi was a devotee of Arunachala, which is a hill sacred to Shiva in South India. So I think it just kind of turned out that way. I mean, maybe Webu Sayadaw of Burma, maybe he was fully enlightened. I never met him, but I've heard only good things about him. So let's see. Why not practice Hinduism instead of Theravada Buddhism? It just doesn't resonate with me as well as Buddhism. Buddhism is more intellectual. It has less fairy tales, and the fairy tales that do exist in Theravada Buddhism can be just set aside and ignored because they're not really important. They're not essential to the teachings. It's just like window dressing or frosting on the cake or whatever. So Buddhism definitely just resonates with me much better. It's more philosophical. It makes better sense. But making good sense isn't really necessary for an enlightenment tradition. I mean, if you got the devotionalism to just worship wholeheartedly Vishnu or Shiva or Hanuman, the monkey god, or Arunachala, the hill, or whatever, or Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary or whatever, I mean, just wholeheartedly, just complete faith in that, then you can go far with that too. It's just that I'm a lukewarm, philosophically minded Westerner with a capacity for skepticism and critical thought. And so Buddhism, I can have more confidence in that. I can feel more at home with Theravada Buddhism than with systems that require belief in elaborate fairy tales that are just built right into the whole system so that you can't get rid of the fairy tales without getting rid of, without just gut shooting the whole system. So that's why. And the Proto-Pseudo-Monk's second question has the heading, on the compatibility of Hinduism or Kriya Yoga and Theravada Buddhist monasticism. So the question is, many Q&As ago I asked you about yoga or Kriya Yoga. I feel very drawn to Kriya Yoga. Kriya, not Korea, but Kriya, which in Pali would be Kiria, Kriya, which means like functional in Pali. But I'm concerned how one could be eclectic, combining spiritual traditions as a Theravada Buddhist monk. For example, how can a monk practice asanas, hatha yoga in rags? One would need something loose but covering private parts, and monks don't wear pants. I think you call it underwear. Also, do monasteries allow monks to read other books, try other practices, pranayama, chanting Om, etc., finding a guru in the Himalaya mountains? Trivial questions, but Vinaya is so strict one must ask. Not having these freedoms might delay me from going forth. Okay, so it's kind of a complex question here. See, where is the first question mark? Let's see. Many questions. See, for example, how can a monk practice asanas, hatha yoga in rags? You can gird your loins. Like with the monks that play soccer, or a monk who's going to climb a tree, or a monk who's going to climb a ladder or something. There's ways to take your lower robe and just kind of wrap it into like a loincloth so that your legs have more freedom of motion and so forth. So you can do that. I mean, you can't do it in public, but in the privacy of your own meditation hut, hell, you can do yoga asanas naked, so long as you're not in some exposed area where people will see you. So let's see here. One would need something loose but covering private parts. Not necessarily. You could be naked if you're all by yourself. Also, do monasteries allow monks to read other books? Yeah. I mean, some strict monasteries, especially if you're a junior monk, they'll just say, just read what you're told to read, or read Pali texts. Don't bother with Western psychology. Don't bother with Hinduism, that kind of thing. But other monasteries are going to be more open to that. There's no real Vinaya rule against it. I think there's a rule against nuns studying esoteric stuff, but there's no rule against monks studying it. And also, the Buddha does say that it's good to be Bahusutta, like in the Mangala Sutta, the list of 38 blessings, being Bahusutta is one of them. And Bahusutta means having learned much, just having like a comprehensive view, being familiar with other religions, other philosophies, other points of view and so forth, actually can help give you a sense of perspective and understand Dhamma better. At least potentially. So let's see. Do monasteries allow monks to read other books? Some do. Try other practices like pranayama or chanting Om. Well, once you've got 5 years of seniority under your belt, you can go solo. You're no longer living in dependence upon a preceptor or upon an acharya or teacher. And so once you're on your own, you can pretty much do as you please. I mean, within the confines of the Vinaya rules. There's no Vinaya rules against doing pranayama or meditating on the syllable Om. You know, meditating on Om is really hardly any more heterodox than meditating on Buddha, which is common in Thailand, even though it's not taught in the suttas at all. So the whole idea of meditating on Buddha, which is like a Thai forest tradition practice, I'm unfamiliar with I'm unaware of any teaching in the suttas recommending that. It's a kind of mantra meditation using a Buddhist mantra, and Om would work just as well, it would seem to me. So finding a guru in the Himalaya mountains, yeah, I mean, that might be a little trickier within the confines of the Vinaya rules, but it's still possible. So, yeah, I mean, your first 5 years as a monk, you have to live in dependence upon a teacher, or your preceptor, or some other teacher, and you pretty much have to do as they say, you know, within reason. But once you've become a Majjhima monk, you know, a monk of middle standing, once you had at least 5 years of seniority, 5 rainy seasons under your belt, then you can do as you please. You can read Western psychology. You can experiment with Hindu meditation techniques. I mean, so long as you're not believing in, you know, that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God who died for your sins and that sort of thing. So long as you're not like a devout Christian or so long as you haven't abandoned the basic principles of Buddhism, you can still sort of experiment and study different things and try different things. And I mean, so long as you're not breaking the rules, and the rules are fairly lenient with regard to just like learning other things. I mean, you might be discouraged from learning like astrology, that kind of thing, but it's not technically against the rules, even though it is discouraged in the suttas. So, yeah, I don't think it's the Vinaya rules are very precise with regard to how you do certain things, how you clean your hut, how you use the toilet, how you eat your meal, this kind of thing. But with regard to what you're allowed to study, it's pretty wide open. So you have more freedom of mind than freedom of body as a monk. As a layperson, you may have more freedom of body than freedom of mind, but as a monk, it's the other way around. So I think I'm just going to move on to the proto-pseudo-monk, formerly known as Cool Whip, his third question, which has the heading of On Hinduism Leading to Truth with its emphasis on samadhi, not vipassana. And so the question is, how can Hindu yogis become enlightened when they follow the path of shamatha? It's all about deep states of meditation to become one with infinite formless consciousness, not understanding reality through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, reality as it is. I'm curious how you reconcile this Hinduism as a path to enlightenment with Orthodox Theravada. Hinduism says creation is God's play or lila, so they are much more permissive. You can enjoy sensuality as long as you are detached, as everything is God, Simply connect with the awareness, become one with it. You can have sex, dance, listen to music, chat, paint, play games, have a family, etc. The key is detachment. You can be drunk and be detached. Less renunciation. If Theravada seems too austere, Hinduism is a nice, you can have your cake and eat it too alternative, but will it lead you to Nibbana, simultaneous spiritual and worldly life? Excited to hear your thoughts. Well, Hinduism, it's not just one system. Hinduism has this broad spectrum of the ridiculous to the sublime. And some of it is wiser than some other aspects. Like in Christianity, it's the same. In Buddhism, it's the same. You're going to have traditions and schools that are wiser. And then you're going to have traditions and schools that are less wise. You know, like some of the contemplative orders in monastic Christianity would be more wise, in my opinion, than the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, even though they're both under the rubric of Christianity. And Hinduism it's possibly even a broader spectrum than Christianity has. So in the Buddhist time, the Hindus, or the Vedicists, the Vedic Brahmins, they were living a life that wasn't all that different from what the Buddhist monks were living. They're just living out in the forest. They may have been tending a sacred fire out there. They had like long matted hair instead of shaving their heads, but it was fairly similar. There was a lot of overlap. And with regard to Hindus, I mean, I've heard this argument before. I've heard this German monk at Pao was really smug about it. It's like Hindus can't possibly become enlightened because they don't practice Vipassana. They only practice Samatha. And he's really smug about it, like he really knew what was what. But insight isn't something that you practice. Insight is something that arises spontaneously, and it is most likely to arise spontaneously after attaining these deep samadhi states. It's like, I've explained this many times before, but it's like your mental states are like waves, and consciousness is like the water. Consciousness is like the essence of your mind, and your mental states are just forms that this consciousness assumes. So most people are lost in the forms. That is what samsara is. Samsara is the forms. Samsara is the waves. I like this wave and I don't like that wave, and this wave is better than that wave, and I want more of this kind of wave and less of that kind of wave. And they just have no concept of water at all. Or maybe they'll just turn water into some other kind of conceptual sort of wave phenomenon that isn't really water anymore. They just converted it into a wave and called it water, just so that it'll fit into this wave-oriented mentality. So, I mean, you want to become enlightened. A good way of going about it, like the traditional ancient Indian Buddhist way, is you get your mind as free of waves as possible, just flat calm, as close to a flat calm as possible. And then you stop being distracted by these waves. And then you're much more likely to get the insight into the essence underlying the waves, because you don't have the waves distracting you anymore. And Hindus do that. So, I mean, if Vipassana or insight can arise spontaneously in a practicing Buddhist after coming out of fourth jhana, why not a Hindu also? So I think the Hindus, they don't have as much of a shortcut as Buddhists do. It's like in Buddhism, you don't really have to be a total master of jhana. It's like some people can see through the waves and just start seeing water when it's still relatively choppy seas. Maybe some Hindus can do that too. But with Hinduism, there's more of an emphasis on getting to the flat calm stage, perfecting flat calm as well as you can. And then like psychic powers can arise also from that sort of approach. In Buddhism, it's like you become enlightened as soon as you can. As soon as you can bail out, you bail out. There is no end to the path. You just keep following the path until you don't need to follow it anymore. And you bail out sideways, so to speak. And it may be that Buddhism has more of a concept of that and makes in us more, I mean, people are less shackled to this idea that nirvana or liberation is at the end of the path when the path really has no end. So it may be that Buddhists have somewhat of an advantage, but Hinduism, still to this day, I would not at all be surprised if there had been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists, partly just because there's more Hindus. You know, just statistically, there's more practitioners that can potentially become enlightened in various ways. And like just Ramana Maharshi and Neem Karoli Baba, comparing those two, you know, they're very different from each other. Their whole approach to religion was different, at least at the outward empirical levels. You know, ultimately, liberation would be the same. So, let's see. Yeah, I really don't think that Theravada Buddhism has a monopoly on enlightenment. I do not think that Christianity has a monopoly on enlightenment. It may be that some people become enlightened as much in spite of a limiting tradition as because of it. But still, you know, you may be a practicing Hindu and you have the near-death experience that just slams you out of your samsaric rut, which is what happened to Ramana Maharshi. He was not a religious person, a particularly religious person. He was a high school student doing his homework, and he suddenly has this kind of a panic attack. He feels like he's dying. So he just lies down, gets ready for death, and it was just boom. He had his liberating insight as a result of just lying there, motionless, not thinking. And it was a kind of, he just went into this deep meditative state and just penetrated samsara. So, yeah, it may be that a Buddhist or a Theravada Buddhist has some sort of advantage, but I don't think that a Buddhist has any kind of monopoly on enlightenment. So I don't know how well I answered that question, but I'm moving on to the next question anyway. And this is from Skuladin or Skuladin, who after experimenting with various names has come back to his home of Skuladin or Skuladin. And he says, would you kindly explain the spirituality of The Trial by Franz Kafka? And yeah, I'm not sure about the spirituality of it, but I do think I kind of understand The Trial by Kafka. It's like, I mean, I haven't read it recently, and I haven't watched the movie recently either. The one, I think it was directed by Orson Welles. Or Orson Welles is in the movie too. It has a very different ending, but still it's within the spirit of The Trial. That I think the crime that Kafka or that Kay was guilty of in The Trial is just questioning the validity of his culture. That it's the people that aren't on trial are the ones that are just going along. You know, they're going along with the brave new world. They're completely lost in samsara. But once you start being skeptical of it, suddenly you're on trial. And it's like, you know, the system will just try to destroy you or force you to assimilate or just, you know, eliminate you. Assimilate or eliminate, one or the other. And one of the main ways of not being on trial is through women. That, you know, as he like Kay in the story is using women as a kind of escape from the trials and tribulations of his trial. I can't remember, there was some statement he makes towards the beginning. It was like shortly after something happened, he found out that he was being investigated, or he got sucked into this trial system. It was, I think his wife died or something. So it was like, you know, it was this event that caused him to start questioning the value of this life that everyone just takes for granted. And it was much more so when The Trial was written, when, you know, you still had just sort of a conservative Western civilization, almost all white people. And, you know, you just get, you go to school, you know, you're born, You obey your parents, you go to school, you graduate, you get a job, you buy a house, you get a wife, you have kids, you get older, you retire, you die. And that was like 99% of the population followed this without question. It was just what you do. And when you start questioning that, that is really the crime. And the system really doesn't like that. I think the system is now much more diffuse. There's much more variation allowed, but still it's the same kind of deal as if you start being skeptical of the whole system, the system kind of turns against you in a way. I think that's what Kafka was writing about in the trial. I'm glad you didn't ask me about The Castle, which is much harder to understand. I read that once, and I'd have to read it at least one more time in order to really get any kind of idea that I've wrapped my head around The Castle. But the trial, I've read it a few times. I've read like various versions of it because the original trial was published from a manuscript, just kind of loose chapters that a friend of Kafka just arranged in a certain way that aren't necessarily the way Kafka intended. There's ways like examining the text that you can see that it's out of order chronologically, the way the final edition was published. So you can rearrange the chapters and it makes a little bit better sense. But I do think that the crime that K committed that caused him eventually to be killed was just questioning the validity of the culture or of just samsara in general. And it reminds me of one time he goes to one of these hearings associated with his case. And he looks at one of the law books on the desk, and it's got like this crude sexual picture scrawled like in the blank pages, like the flyleaf or whatever. And it really is, sex is one of the main things that holds the system together. And there is a statement that everybody is involved in the trial process. Like all the people that aren't on trial are the ones that are like participating in the system that, is sort of like they're responsible for the trial, which does mean it's kind of like society and the beliefs of some society, like samsaric group unenlightenment is the establishment system. And so any kind of skepticism towards that is the crime against sort of nature in a way. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question about as well as I'm likely to. It's really not fresh in my mind. I haven't read the trial recently. So Skoladin or Skuladin's second question, would you kindly explain the synchronicity of twins? And then he's got his characteristic bullet points. The proto-pseudo-monk has headings. Skuladin has bullet points. And so the bullet points say, there have been documented accounts of twins separated at birth, but they share many similarities. They marry similar looking women with the same first name, use same brand products, same hairstyle. Yeah, it's true. I've read about cases like that too. Like identical twins, especially, who are separated when they were infants. It's like they send each other a birthday card. They send each other exactly the same birthday card. They just have the same tastes in things. They like the same kind of women with the same kind of names, and they have similar jobs or whatever. It's just sort of like two versions of the same person. And it is possible that a more Buddhist explanation is that they were just, they're sort of like twin spirits. They've sort of occurred together life after life. It might be that they're twins in this life. It may be like they're father and son in a different existence. They might be husband and wife in a different existence. Just, it's just for some reason in Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, his poem about the Buddha, that the Buddha and Yasodhara, his wife, were kind of like that too. I think if that's the right poem. But I remember reading this poem where, the Buddha and his wife Yasodhara were just sort of life after life after life appearing together, in various relations. They were kind of bound up together. Their two karmic streams were just sort of like doing this dance around each other. And it could be like that. That would be a more Buddhist explanation. A less Buddhist explanation would be that you've got a karmic stream that just bifurcates and splits in half. So it's sort of like one being splits into two. Which, there would be a certain overlap between that theory and the previous one. But like karmic streams splitting into two would not be orthodox Theravada Buddhism. I've never read anything that would support that hypothesis in Theravada Buddhist texts. So, let's see. I guess, there's other ways of guessing what the meaning of it is. It's like the same being gets reincarnated twice in the same time frame. It's like two versions of the same being. But that would be, you're getting farther and farther out with that. Not all identical twins really are so identical that, some identical twins really are not just like the same person twice. Like even Siamese twins, like the original Siamese twins, I think they were named like Chang and Ang or something like that. One of them was a heavy drinker and the other one didn't drink at all. Although he didn't have to. He'd get drunk whenever his brother drank, I suppose. But I worked with two identical twins just a few years ago. And they had different temperaments. And usually the more alpha of two twins is going to be the one that was born first. I'm not exactly sure why that is. He might be born just 8 minutes first, 8 minutes before the other one, but still, for some reason, the parents will, he was the one that was born first, so he gets named first when they're talking about the two kids, Jim and Joe. That if Joe was born, or if Jim would be born first, so it's Jim and Joe instead of the other way around, and Jim would just sort of be like considered the elder brother and just take on more of an alpha personality. Or it may be that two identical twins, both of them have sort of individualistic leanings, and so one of them will adopt one kind of attitude and the other one will adopt a different one just to be different. And if the other one adopted his first, then the first one would do something different just to be different, just because they both have this individualistic wanting to be different kind of attitude. So it can be that way too. But just their similarity from the biological point of view, it's just that, they've inherited like psychological qualities that, the left just vehemently, sometimes hysterically wants to deny. There's no such thing as human nature. There's no human animal instincts. That it's all cultural. That like intelligence tests and all this kind of thing. It's all cultural. We're molded by our culture, like Karl Marx would say. We're products of our culture, and that it's not genetic. But the empirical evidence does seem to indicate that probably most of our personality traits are genetically conditioned. And so you've got two genetically identical twins. They're going to have the same like psychological genetics. So in a lot of ways, they're going to have the same kind of taste, maybe the same favorite color. They like the same kind of music, that kind of thing, just because it's like their inherent congenital character, their constitutional factors are so similar. Although it may be that they both have this maverick kind of attitude, which will then cause them to deliberately diverge from each other and be different. But from the karmic point of view, the best Buddhist explanation would be that they've been associated with each other lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, and they've just grown very similar. So I'm just going to move on to Skuladin or Skuladine's third question, which is, would you kindly explain past life memories? And then he's got in his bullet points, Brian's friend John Kaminsky shared an anecdote once about how he drove his friend and his kid to a stranger's home because the kid was claiming past life memories and wouldn't shut the fuck up about it. The kid walks up to the house, an old lady appears, they talk. Old lady returns with a shoebox full of crap. Kid walks back to car with box of crap, then straps on newly acquired gold watch. Heads explode. And I mean, I've read quite a few case histories like this. I think his name was Ian Stevenson. He was a professor at the University of Virginia or something like that, who wrote books compiling case histories like this. And I mean, it was pretty much just like Sculadin or Sculadine says with regard to like little kids, they remember being somebody else. And, you know, they'll just keep insisting that, you know, I'm not this little kid, you know, I'm this prosperous pharmacist who lives in this village 40 miles from here. And, you know, I died of like some kind of poisoning. And so there was one story that was kind of touching. This little girl, she just insisted that she was born in that house over there and she could name the people that live there by name. Yeah, I guess you'd have to name them by name, wouldn't you? But I mean, finally she gets brought there and she starts bossing around these grown people and they're kind of like smiling at her like she's just this cute little girl. And then she says something like, I'm still your mother, I'm just small now. And I mean, there's a lot of cases like this. And so Ian Stevenson was using that as a kind of scientific or empirical evidence for reincarnation. That sometimes the kids would know stuff that they shouldn't, I mean, they wouldn't really be able to know unless there was some kind of conspiracy, I guess, some sort of deliberate hoax. But it doesn't necessarily work out the way Theravada Buddhism says it was. Like one of the most memorable cases in one of Ian Stevenson's books is there was this boy in India who apparently died of smallpox. And so his father went out to make the arrangements for the burial. His son had just died. But then when he comes back home, the boy is awake again, but he's claiming to be somebody else. He's claiming to be this Brahmin that lived in a neighborhood not far away, or maybe it was a town not far away. And since the family he was born into wasn't Brahmin, he would refuse to eat his mother's cooking. There was like this Brahmin neighbor lady who had to cook his meals for him. And he would just insist that, you know, I'm not this kid, I'm this other person. And so, I mean, that's kind of in violation of the Buddhist teachings. I mean, technically, it kind of works. It's just reincarnation into a body that's already like 7 years old after the previous occupant of that body had passed on. So maybe there could be some way that it would be in accordance with Theravada Buddhism, but generally it is not supposed to work that way. Also, I read a different book by Ian Stevenson where there was some Thai Ajahn talking about how he was reincarnated or reborn before his other life had died. That for a while he was sort of vacillating between this baby and this like ancient person on his deathbed. You know, he was just bedridden, kind of in a semi-coma a lot of the time, just unconscious a lot of the time. It took him a long time to finally fade out. And so he was sort of fading out as this old person and fading in as this new person, like simultaneously. And that's not supposed to happen in Buddhism either. And who knows? I mean, it's mainly just like anecdotal, you know, just unverifiable evidence. But there is a lot of that kind of evidence, many cases. And Ian Stevenson was deliberately trying to find kids claiming to be this other person where the two families hadn't really communicated yet, so that he could really find, you know, he could do his best to see if they could name names and know stuff about this other family that they couldn't possibly have heard yet through intercommunication. So, apparently some little kids can remember their past lives. My little brother, for example, used to talk about when he was a man. But This could just be like the imagination of little kids in that case anyway. Ian Stevenson also was doing a study on birthmarks, how some people will have like a birthmark that corresponds to some fatal injury they received in their previous life. Like a weird purple line here when they died of getting their neck gashed or that kind of thing. So, could I kindly explain past life memories? That is the question. And I mean, I don't know exactly the mechanism of how it works. That some little kids can still have lingering memories from the previous life. That, I mean, it's like a psychic power in Buddhism, that once you get into these meditative attainments, you get jhana and psychic powers, then you can remember your past lives. My father tried to do that through hypnosis. Through hypnotizing himself or being hypnotized by another person, he could have past life regressions. And, he strongly identified with some Scottish fellow who lived back around the 1700s named Jason Haskell, for example. And it could just be like hypnotic imagination, just cooking up these realistic, vivid memories of stuff that never happened. I mean, it's hard to know for sure. There's another case of my father was friends with this husband and wife who lived on a big farm out in the country, and they would take in troubled teenagers. Just the fresh air, just being away from town, the cows and everything, just kind of helped them to ground themselves, these kids, and it would often help them to kind of straighten things out for themselves. There's less distraction from this, punk culture or whatever it was, just the fresh air, doing, light chores, milking the cows, collecting the eggs, that kind of thing. It just helped them to kind of get their feet back on the ground and straighten out a bit. But anyways, there was this one teenage girl, maybe 14 years old, who was out there, and all of a sudden she just lost all interest in her appearance. She lost all interest in school. She wouldn't communicate. She just shut up. She didn't want to talk. And so this husband and wife knew my father was a hypnotist, asked him, would you be willing to hypnotize this girl and just kind of help to resolve this problem that she's having that she won't tell anybody about? So my father said, well, I'm willing to do it so long as she's willing, and she would have to bring somebody that she trusts, preferably another girl, some friend of hers, as a chaperone, just for ethics, just with no scandals, no hint of scandals, anything like that. There should be someone she trusts as a chaperone when he hypnotizes the girl. So it all worked out that way. This girl brought a friend of hers, and my father is hypnotizing the girl in question. And suddenly he notices that the chaperone, this other girl, has got her eyes closed and she's waving her arms around like this. And my father asks, what are you doing? And she says, I'm swimming. And he says, where are you swimming? And she says, in the South Pacific. And he says, why are you swimming? And she says, my ship has been torpedoed by the Japanese. And he asks her name, and she says her name is Mark Ellison. And she's a sailor during World War II who drowned in the South Pacific. And my father's fascinated by this. He wants to know like the name of the ship and maybe even Mark Ellison's serial number so he can verify this stuff. But he's not really there for her. He's trying to help this other girl. So he just kind of puts that on the back burner. And, he just suggests to the first girl who's clammed up and everything that if she's got any problems, it helps to to talk it out with somebody, to just, unburden her heart with somebody that she trusts. And then he took them both out of the hypnotic trance. Then they went for a walk through the woods, because we lived out in the country there too. And the girl just kind of blurts out to her that even though she was like 14 years old, she was pregnant, and she didn't even know who the father was, because she was that kind of girl. She started early. So, anyways, my father was still intrigued by this Mark Ellison case. And so he hypnotizes the girl again. But this time, she has no interest at all in Mark Ellison. She won't regress to Mark Ellison. Instead, she wants to find a calf on the farm that is lost. That a cow had her calf somewhere that they can't find it. And I mean, cows do this sometimes. And so she just located it. It was somehow in like a clump of blackberry bushes on the other side of the fence. She found the calf, but she wasn't interested in Mark Ellison that time. So my father never was able to follow up on that, which is generally how it works. It's a liminal kind of thing that is, you can't really verify it very well. It's like the whole system is sort of rigged against verifying it. So how this actually works, I don't know exactly. I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, and the Burmese would call it Luwin Za, which is just a person who is influenced by their previous existence. Like a transsexual person is kind of a Luwin Za. It's like they're making a transition from male to female, and the transition isn't complete within a single life. Or there was one case in the Ian Stevenson book about this girl in Burma who insisted that she was a Japanese man, that apparently a Japanese soldier died in Burma during World War II, was reincarnated as this Burmese village girl, and she just vehemently insisted. I knew this, one of my main supporters in Burma, there's a good chance that she was a man in her previous existence. She was just a dedicated spinster. She never got married, and she was just this aggressive, kind of bigoted, kind of prejudiced kind of a person. And she showed me pictures of her as a girl, and she would always be hiding her face because she was ashamed of being a girl, even at like the age of 3 or 4. She'd want to wear boys' clothes. She'd cry if they put girls' clothes on her. She'd cry if they gave her like a girl's hairstyle or anything like that. And it was pretty clear to me from a Buddhist point of view that she was probably a man who was very like misogynistic, very chauvinistic against women, and then as sort of a karmic payback got reborn as a woman in this life. So I'm not answering the question though, am I? How would you kindly explain past life memories? The stuff that carries over, like in past life regressions, tend to be the most emotionally intense. Like emotionally intense experiences seem to create the most karma. And so those are the memories that usually come up in past life regressions. And from the Buddhist point of view, for the most part, it's just rebirth and like residual memories from a previous life somehow carrying over into the next life. Although there's also other ways of explaining it. So I've already talked about that for several minutes, I guess. So I think whatever rambling I did on that topic will be considered my answer. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which apparently is some kind of joke question that I don't really understand. And this is from Shushij. And Shushij says, cow goes moo, frog goes croak, and the elephant goes toot, ducks say quack, and fish go blub, and the seal goes ow, ow, ow. But there's one sound that no one knows. What does the fox say? And somebody in the comments under this comment says, I reckon Punyo is one of 0.001% of Americans that won't know that reference unless the monasteries in Burma blasted it through their speakers. So apparently it was some kind of song that I've never heard before, and based on the lyrics here, it's just as well that I've never heard this song before. But I do know the answer. See, the cow goes moo, frog goes croak, the elephant goes toot, ducks say quack, and fish go blub. Well, fish, I don't think they really go blub. And the seal goes ow, ow, ow. But what does the fox say? The fox goes earth. Because when I was a little kid, like 3 years old, it's like when there's little kids, the parents or grown-ups will ask you these questions. What does the cow say? the cow says moo, and what does the frog say? And the frog says croak. And my father would ask me, what does your mama say? And it was just the tradition in my family that mama goes earth like the fox, because when she'd get the hiccups, she'd make this earthing sound that my father said sounded like a fox. So foxes go earth, kind of like my mother hiccuping. So there, I knew the answer to that one. And I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Tummelplatz, which apparently is German for playground. And so playground says, what was your training like as a novice monk? And it turns out I was a novice monk twice. I was a temporary novice for 5 weeks as a kind of dress rehearsal for being a fully ordained bhikkhu, like a year before I finally took the plunge. And then I was also a novice shortly before my ordination as a bhikkhu. I was a novice for a total of 1 day, like the second time. The first time, my training I was a Donlaba, just a temporary ordination. And they recommended that I be fully ordained as a monk because you get more benefit from being a monk, because the Burmese are spiritual materialists and just think that you're going to get better karma for a higher ordination. But I didn't want to do that because I didn't know the rules. I didn't want to be a sloppy monk, and I'd be better off just as a novice, just to test the waters. And, I do a little studying. I did a lot of meditation. Just reading Pali texts, English translations. I didn't know Pali yet, and meditating a lot. And that was about all I was doing for those 5 weeks. The first time I was a novice, and the second time, it was 24 hours. So there wasn't a whole lot of training going on then. But I don't know if Playground is even asking about being a Samanera. In Theravada Buddhism, there's 2 levels of ordination for a male, 3 levels for a female, 2 levels for a male. There's Samanera or novice, and then there's bhikkhu or monk. And as a novice, it wasn't that different from just being a monk. Just being a junior monk, I took Pali lessons and Vinaya lessons from my teacher Utesaniya, and meditated a lot and studied, and that was about it. I'd do like little chores around the place. I'd water the bamboo plants up by the pagoda, that kind of thing. But there wasn't really anything really intense. So I guess I answered that question. And so I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Robert. And Robert says, how do you view evolution if matter does not exist? And this is a good question. And it's something that has been kind of a challenge for me also. And that I really do not think that physical matter is ultimately real. But from an empirical or scientific point of view, it's fairly obvious that organic evolution, more or less in accordance with Charles Darwin's theories, has occurred. That just looking at the fossil record, for example, the oldest levels, the oldest geological strata, no sign of life. Then eventually you start getting signs of anaerobic bacteria like colonial encrusting bacteria. There'll be fossils of that. And then there's nothing but anaerobic bacteria for billions of years. And then like maybe a billion years ago, there's enough free oxygen in the atmosphere due to photosynthesis and so forth that finally you can start getting eukaryotic organisms like protozoans that then start becoming colonial. They start making clusters and turning into animals and plants. And it's just, you can see through the geological strata that, the more, the higher the strata, the newer the strata, the closer you get to what you see nowadays. Like in the oldest strata, no mammals, no primates, no birds, no reptiles. Not even fish at first. And then you just have like clam-like creatures, worm-like creatures that gradually they're diversifying through random mutations and just the dying out of the bad mutations and the promotion, the success, competitive success of the good mutations, which are like 1 in 10,000, until finally you wind up with, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, primates, hominoids humans. Not that we're at the top. It's like whatever's alive today is all at the top. So how does that reconcile with me thinking that there is no such thing as like ultimately real physical matter? Well, one thing is, I mean, it doesn't have to be real matter. I mean, it's so long as it is the perceptions of it may be that there were beings that were observing the earth that were participating in this, or it may be that even this early life had very simple primordial mental states that had their own karma, and it could be sort of like Schopenhauer's concept of will, where you've got this essentially a mental state. Will is essentially a mental state that is just wanting to fill every niche that it can, to just like manifest itself as fully as it can, just through this will to exist. That, I mean, that could have been going on, back like 1 billion years or more. But the only way that it could really have happened, even if it wasn't material, would be you'd have to have some sort of small g god, some kind of Brahma, who is sort of generating this, with their own mind, or at least kind of locking it down by perceiving it, sort of collapsing the state vector by seeing it. But aside from that, I still have to accept the possibility that there really was no evolution before modern humans, until modern humans came along and just sort of collapsed the state vector down into some stable configuration that would account for our existence from an empirical point of view, which is hard to wrap your head around, I have to admit. But like Arthur C. Clarke used to say, the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. But it either happened at the level of mentality, or it's just kind of jerry-rigged retroactively as a way of making sense of the world we live in from a scientific point of view. Like, for example, photons. It may be that photons simply did not exist until humans like hypothesized them and then started like capturing them with scientific devices, measuring them, that sort of thing. That they just kind of like coalesce this, I don't know what you call it, almost like chaos, primordial chaos or something. Just coalesced it down into something that makes sense from a materialistic point of view. So those are like my two main hypotheses. One is that you had some higher being who has all this going on in its mind, maybe a group of higher beings, just sort of, who knows how many higher beings, all sort of on the same page of samsara, so to speak, that are kind of locking in these events. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Or it could be that it was just the uncollapsed state vector from a material point of view, that when mind became advanced enough, it was able to sort of collapse things down into a plausible kind of explanation of things, which still is not entirely like 100% concrete. There's still these weird loopholes, and scientists are saying now that some scientists are saying that evolution couldn't possibly happen because of this or that kind of mechanism that wouldn't allow it to happen. It's just mathematically impossible or some such. So who knows? It may be that when there's another Copernican revolution, that there's just going to be a revolution in understanding how we got here. So it's still kind of a challenge for me to reconcile the like a kind of idealism, or just the matter is not ultimately real, with pretty obvious to anyone who knows the evidence that organic evolution occurred over a period of billions of years on this planet. So I'm just going to move on to Robert's next question. Why do our minds create a world where we see evidence of evolution? Yes, I've already kind of touched on that, where we need to have some kind of plausible explanation, because if we can't come up with a plausible explanation, it destabilizes our samsara. It destabilizes our version of reality. We have to lock it down with these beliefs that are believable. And just God made it that way is no longer really believable to a postmodern materialistic mindset. And so you have to have some kind of scientifically plausible explanation. And it's just kind of hard to explain otherwise. Either that, or it's like I said, that you've got higher beings that were already setting this thing in motion before we came along. Which does, I mean, that's a fairly good guess also. So, I mean, there were volcanoes long before people knew what volcanoes were. Stars in the sky long before people knew what stars were. We still don't really know what stars are. You know, we've got our scientific explanations, and they're pretty locked down, pretty solid. Ultimately, it's not true, but within the context of samsara, that's what a star is. You know, it's this thermonuclear explosion going on. You know, gravity kind of holding it together, while it's like the force of the hydrogen atoms fusing into helium is pushing out, and it's in a state of equilibrium, producing lots of heat and light and so forth, lots of radiation. It's just whatever this version of samsara, the minds in this version of samsara have settled on that, or it could be even before that, and it's very hard to explain, and that's one reason, I suppose, why the Buddha didn't even want to go there. So, next question from Robert. Is there a mind-only evolution that maybe happened in our realm? Yeah, I mean, mind does seem to be more obvious than matter to me. That anything we know is going to be mental. I mean, you can hold up the cup, you know, it's red, but that's a visual perception. That's mental. You can feel the weight of it, but that's a tactile sensation, which is mental. You can feel its coolness because the coffee's gone, the hardness, tactile sensations, which are mental. You can tap it, you hear the clink, auditory sensations, which are mental. You only know this. This only exists mentally. So, evolution in that sense is mental, because, you know, the whole theory of evolution is mental. The whole understanding of evolution is mental because understanding is mental. But it could be also that there's more of a karmic, spiritual kind of evolution of mind that, I mean, you start with primitive life forms on this planet, and as life forms have become more complex, also mental states have become more complex. I doubt that an ammonite mollusk had as complex of a mind as we do. But they ruled the oceans up until fish came along. So, yeah, I mean, I'm quite open to the idea of mental evolution, both as kind of like what lies behind Darwinian evolution, like Schopenhauer's will manifesting itself, kind of fueling evolution that way, or also more of a karmic spiritual evolution at a different level. I think both of those are plausible arguments. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. I didn't even realize that until just now. It's from Luke Helzer. And Luke Helzer says, what do you think of the statement, no one is more hated than he who speaks the truth? Well, I think that that's kind of an exaggeration. You know, it makes a pithy little saying, but I think there are people that are hated more than people who speak the truth. I mean, people who speak the truth, they tend out, I mean, traditionally, stereotypically, they wind up being martyrs, you know, persecuted into oblivion, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there are people who are hated worse than people who simply tell the truth. So let's see, just really an evil person is going to be hated more than some saintly person or just some honest person who tells the truth. But it is true that people who speak ugly truths, and there are ugly truths, true statements that you simply cannot say publicly, or your career, your reputation, your life will be destroyed. At the very least, you're just going to be marginalized into a nobody that no one will listen to, and you won't have any platform. You'll be kicked off all social media and all this, except for maybe BitChute or Minds, where you can just rant away and nobody cares. But there are fairly obvious facts, empirical facts, you cannot say in public, or you're just going to have a ton of bricks dumped on you. Like, for example, human biodiversity. Can't go there. So there's definitely like an element of truth to the statement that no one is more hated than he who speaks the truth. But it's not really true that no one is more hated. It's just that people who speak the truth outspokenly are going to face a hell of a lot of resentment, and they may wind up being martyred to the system. They're sort of like K in Kafka's trial. They wind up as part of the process. I think that's the original name of the book is Der Prozess. It's in German, just it's the process rather than the trial. So this kind of goes back to Kafka, because the person who speaks the truth, or the person who has an inkling that there is a truth that is beyond what everyone is believing, that they become like criminals. They become enemies of the system. Hate speech. They're purveyors of hate speech. So, yeah, I don't agree that no one is more hated than he who speaks the truth, but he who speaks the truth is going to result in a lot of resentment and hatred and so forth from a lot of people who are not nearly so honest or not nearly so perceptive. And I guess we're done. So, gosh, I'm going faster, I guess. This is less than 2.5 hours. There's quite a lot of questions, although some of them were pretty easy or just had short answers. But then some of them I was just kind of blathering along for several minutes without ever really addressing the question. So we did pretty good. And so if you have any questions about things that you think I can answer, especially if it has something to do with Dhamma or Dharma, you're just kind of curious about something or other. That's fine. But, yeah, it's good if it's like philosophical kind of questions that I can actually understand. There was one question that I just didn't understand at all. So, yeah, if you have any questions you think I can answer, like early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Buddhism in general, Indian spirituality in general, Eastern spirituality in general, spirituality in total general, things like that, meditation, monasticism, Burma, that kind of thing. And my metta goes to the people of Burma who experienced a devastating earthquake recently. The Burmese, they really can't catch a break sometimes. In a way, it's kind of ironic that they're the most devoutly Buddhist country in the world, and they're having like tropical storms and earthquakes and military dictatorships and civil wars and this kind of stuff going on all the time. But in a way, it's maybe better than what a lot of people in some place like Chicago are going through right now, or Detroit or Oakland, that are, some places they're just like hell realms. At least the problems in Burma are relatively simple and straightforward. Whereas the problems in America, they're kind of like got more of a poisonous root to them, it seems to me. But I mean, there's always going to be dukkha. Everyone's going to have problems. And I'm not even answering a question anymore. So like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And remember, no more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And be happy.